Hey everyone, you know some ships vanish without a trace? Others are found eerily intact, drifting with nobody aboard, completely empty. Today's video, we're going to take a look at 15 ships that disappeared without a trace. Number 15. The SS Waratah. The SS Waratah was a British passenger and cargo steamship that vanished without a trace off the coast of South Africa in 1909 during her second voyage from Australia to the UK. Launched in 1908 by the Blue Anchor Line, she was a new vessel, modern, well-equipped, and designed for both cargo and luxury. With accommodations for over 750 people and, at the time, state-of-the-art steam propulsion, the Waratah was viewed as a promising addition to the company's fleet. On July 26, 1909, she departed from Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town, with over 200 people on board. At the time, conditions were not extreme, and the ship had recently passed another vessel, the Clan McIntyre, which noted the Waratah steaming normally. However, after that last confirmed sighting, the Waratah never arrived in Cape Town and was never seen again. No wreckage, lifeboats, or identifiable debris was ever conclusively linked to the ship. What makes this disappearance especially unusual is the extensive search effort that followed. The British Admiralty and private vessels scoured thousands of nautical miles, but nothing was recovered. Theories have ranged from capsizing due to a suspected top-heavy design to being overwhelmed by a rogue wave or strong currents. However, no definitive explanation has ever emerged. Over the decades, numerous expeditions and sonar scans have attempted to locate the remains, especially in the region between Durban and Cape Town. Some wrecks have been found in that area, but none have been positively identified as the Waratah. The absence of any evidence has kept the ship's fate open-ended. Today, the Waratah is sometimes referred to as Australia's Titanic, not because of any connection to tragedy, but because of its similar role as a state-of-the-art passenger vessel that vanished suddenly in peacetime conditions. This story remains one of the maritime world's most enduring unsolved disappearances. Number 14. The MV Joyita. The MV Joyita is one of the most perplexing mysteries in the 20th century. A 70-foot wooden merchant vessel built in 1931, it was known for durability and had seen service as a patrol boat during World War II. By 1955, she was operating in the South Pacific, transporting cargo and small numbers of passengers between islands. On October 3, 1955, the Joyita set out from Samoa on a routine journey, carrying 25 people and medical supplies. The voyage was expected to take only a couple of days, but the vessel never arrived. After an extensive aerial and naval search, no signs of the ship or its occupants were initially found. 5 weeks later, on November 10th, a merchant ship spotted her adrift more than 600 miles from her intended route. The vessel was badly listing, partially flooded and abandoned. There was no one on board, and much of the cargo was missing, yet the ship itself was still afloat. The engines were found to be inoperative, but the lifeboats, logbooks, and navigational equipment had all vanished. Despite the vessel's damaged state, investigators concluded that it had not sunk because of its airtight compartments and cork lining, and the ship was still buoyant and could have remained so indefinitely. This made the decision to abandon her all the more puzzling. There were no signs of foul play or external damage that might suggest collision or piracy. The most likely explanation is that a mechanical failure, possibly compounded by poor communication equipment and rising water, led the crew to believe the vessel was in danger, even though it wasn't. Why all 25 people left a floating, seaworthy ship and were never found remains unexplained. Unlike many disappearances at sea, this one's remarkable because the vessel was found intact and afloat. It's not the loss of the ship, but the absence of the people and the inexplicable condition of the scene that's baffled historians for decades. Number 13. The SS Baychimo. The SS Baychimo was a steel-hulled cargo steamer owned by Hudson's Bay Company and launched in 1914 and originally used in the fur trade along the remote coasts of Alaska and Canada. Built in Sweden, the ship was renamed Baychimo after its purchase by the British company, and it became a common sight in the Arctic waters, transporting goods between trading posts. In October 1931, while en route from Vancouver to deliver furs and trade supplies along the Arctic coast, the Baychimo became trapped in pack ice off the coast of Barrow, now Utqiagvik, in Alaska. The crew was experienced in navigating these waters. They initially abandoned the ship temporarily and sheltered nearby when conditions worsened. When the ice shifted, the ship was freed, and then trapped again. Eventually, on October 15th, the Hudson's Bay Company evacuated most of the crew by aircraft, leaving a small party behind to keep watch. A few days later, a blizzard struck, and when the weather cleared, the Baychimo was gone. It had vanished from its last known position in the ice. The watch crew assumed it had sunk, but within days the vessel was spotted drifting about 45 miles away, still afloat, though no longer in a condition suitable for recovery. The crew salvaged some cargo and left the vessel to the sea. This was not the end of the story. For the next several decades, it was seen repeatedly drifting through the Beaufort Sea. Whalers, fishermen, and Arctic explorers occasionally reported sightings of the ship, sometimes even boarding it briefly to shelter from storms. In some cases, expeditions tried to tow or salvage it, but none of them succeeded. The last confirmed sighting of the Baychimo was in 1969, 38 years after it had been abandoned, when she was seen frozen in an ice pack off the Alaskan coast. After that, this ghost ship disappeared once again, this time for good. No wreckage has ever positively been identified, and her final fate remains unknown. Unlike many lost ships, the Baychimo didn't vanish suddenly. Instead, she became a rare example of a vessel that outlived its crew by decades. Number 12. The HMS Atalanta. HMS Atalanta was a British Royal Navy training ship that vanished in 1880 during a voyage from Bermuda to England. Originally launched as a frigate in 1844 under the name HMS Juno, she was converted in 1878 to a training ship for young naval recruits. The ship was used to teach seamanship and naval discipline, and though she was considered seaworthy, she was aging and relied heavily on sail power. In January 1880, the Atalanta departed Bermuda with a complement of more than 280 people on board, including cadets and crew. It was her first major voyage as a training ship intended to return to England through the Atlantic. After she left port on January 31st, she was never heard from again. When the ship failed to arrive as expected, the Royal Navy launched search efforts, but no wreckage or signs of the vessel were ever found. Several ships sailing the Atlantic during that period reported encountering severe storms, and it's assumed that the Atalanta may have succumbed to these conditions. However, the complete lack of debris, survivors, or distress signals has continued to fuel questions. Reports indicated that she may have been overcrowded, especially with inexperienced trainees, and may be top-heavy, a problematic condition for any ship relying on sailing through rough seas. Although the loss of the HMS Atalanta resulted in changes to Royal Navy training, no official explanation has ever been confirmed. The ship and her passengers were declared lost at sea, and memorials were later erected in Portsmouth and other naval towns in honor of the young recruits. Now, what makes this case notable is not just the mystery of the disappearance, but the total absence of any clues. In contrast to many maritime incidents where at least some evidence washes ashore, the Atalanta left behind nothing at all, no lifeboats, no cargo, no messages in bottles. It was as if she simply vanished into the Atlantic. Number 11. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen was a 524-foot-long T2 tanker ship originally built during World War II, and then later converted to carry molten sulfur in bulk. On February 2, 1963, the ship departed from Beaumont, Texas, carrying over 15,000 tons of molten sulfur bound for Virginia. After passing the Florida Straits, the ship and its 39 crew members were never heard from again. Originally intended to transport oil, the Sulphur Queen had been retrofitted with large insulated tanks to carry heated liquid sulfur, which had to be maintained at over 135 degrees Celsius. These modifications were considered problematic by engineers, and concerns had been raised about the integrity of the ship, particularly regarding the heat stress on the hull and the corrosive nature of the cargo. On February 4th, 2 days after her departure, the last known radio message from the ship was received near the southern tip of Florida. It contained nothing unusual. After that, silence. When the ship failed to arrive at its destination, a massive search was launched by the U.S. Coast Guard, covering more than 350,000 square miles of ocean. Some debris was eventually found, including life preservers and a few pieces of floating equipment, but no wreckage, no logbooks, or cargo was ever recovered. The ship had vanished completely, and the exact location remains unknown. A later investigation by the U.S. Coast Guard concluded that the ship likely broke apart at sea due to a combination of structural weakness and shifting cargo. However, no definitive cause was ever established, and the absence of a wreck site has left the case unresolved. The Marine Sulphur Queen is frequently cited in discussions of maritime disappearances in the so-called Bermuda Triangle. There is no evidence of supernatural involvement, but what is certain is that the ship disappeared in heavily traveled and relatively well-monitored parts of the ocean, without any clear signal of distress. This story is a reminder of how vulnerable even large vessels can be when structural limitations meet unpredictable ocean conditions. Number 10. The SS Poet. The SS Poet. It was a 520-foot American bulk cargo ship that disappeared in the North Atlantic Ocean in October of 1980. She was built in 1944 as a Navy transport ship and later repurposed for commercial use. The Poet was carrying a load of corn from Philadelphia to Port Said in Egypt when it vanished without explanation. The ship was last heard from on October 24th when it was several hundred miles east of Delaware Bay. The Poet was considered seaworthy at the time of the departure, operated by a reputable company, and manned by a 34-person crew. The ship had undergone recent inspections and was not reported to have any significant issues. Yet despite a routine start to the voyage, the vessel never arrived at its destination. When the Poet failed to make radio contact or reach Port Said on schedule, the U.S. Coast Guard initiated a search covering over 200,000 square miles of ocean. The effort included aircraft, ships, and satellite tracking, but it turned up no debris, oil slicks, or floating cargo. No emergency beacon either had been activated. It was as if the ship had simply vanished from the sea. Investigators considered several possibilities, including a sudden structural failure, shifting cargo, or maybe a collision. Another theory suggested that a rogue wave or sudden storm might have overwhelmed the ship, but no extreme weather was recorded in that area at the time. The possibility of a mechanical failure, like a loss of power combined with water ingress, was also discussed, though no evidence has been found to confirm any of those hypotheses. The final report by the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board was inconclusive. Without physical evidence or survivor accounts, its fate could not be determined. Because the ship disappeared in international waters, there was also jurisdictional uncertainty around the investigation and questions raised about oversight and reporting protocols for these older U.S.-flagged merchant vessels operating abroad. To this day, no trace of the SS Poet has ever been located, and her disappearance is one of the most recent unexplained losses of a commercial ship in the North Atlantic. Number 9. The USS Cyclops. The USS Cyclops. This was a massive U.S. Navy collier ship launched in 1910 to transport coal for fueling naval vessels. At over 540 feet long, it was the largest ship in the Navy's fleet at the time of its disappearance. On March 4, 1918, during World War I, the Cyclops vanished without a trace while sailing from Barbados to Baltimore. It was carrying over 10,000 tons of manganese ore and had 309 people on board. The Cyclops had already completed a portion of her voyage, having stopped in Rio de Janeiro and then Barbados to resupply. Her departure from Barbados was uneventful, and she didn't report any mechanical or navigational issues. No distress calls were received, and the ship was never seen or heard from again. The weather was reportedly calm, and no evidence of enemy activity was present along her expected route. An extensive search followed, but nothing, no debris, oil slicks, cargo, or wreckage was ever recovered, and the disappearance shocked the Navy and the American public due to the size of the vessel and the calm sailing conditions. The Navy's final report simply stated, quote, "The disappearance of the ship is one of the most baffling mysteries in the annals of the Navy Department," end quote. Several theories have been proposed over the years, including structural failure due to the heavy manganese load, potential instability from the ballast configuration, or even issues with the ship's crankshaft, which was reportedly in need of repair. Still, no definitive answer has ever emerged, and unlike lost ships in battle, the Cyclops left behind no clues. What sets this one apart is not just the loss of the large vessel, but that it was the first in a series of similar disappearances involving ships of the same class, the Proteus-class collier. Two of the Cyclops' sister ships, the USS Proteus and the USS Nereus, also disappeared years later under equally mysterious circumstances. The Cyclops' case remains the largest non-combat loss of life in U.S. Navy history, unrelated to enemy action. Though often associated with tales of the Bermuda Triangle, the ship's disappearance occurred outside the commonly defined boundaries of that area. The truth, even over a century later, is still unknown. Number 8. The SS Kamloops. The SS Kamloops was a Canadian steamship operated by the Canada Steamships Line, built in 1924 and used primarily for carrying general cargo across the Great Lakes. On December 6, 1927, the ship departed from Fort William, now Thunder Bay, Ontario, bound for the lower Great Lakes, carrying a mixed load that included pipes, shoes, food supplies, and farming equipment. After making her last known contact while passing through the Soo Locks, the Kamloops vanished while navigating Lake Superior. A severe snowstorm had moved in, which reduced visibility and created some difficult sailing conditions. When the ship failed to arrive as scheduled, search efforts were launched, including an aircraft and surface vessels, but no trace of the ship was found. At the time, Lake Superior was already known for the violent storms and frigid conditions of it, particularly in the late autumn and early winter. The Kamloops remained missing for over half a century. It wasn't until 1977, 50 years after her disappearance, that a team of divers located the shipwreck in relatively deep water off Isle Royal, in the northwest part of Lake Superior. The vessel was found upright and remarkably well preserved. What makes this story unique is how long the ship remained hidden, despite the relatively confined search area. Lake Superior's depth, the complex currents, and the remote wilderness shoreline helped conceal the wreck for decades. The cargo was still largely intact, with boots and canned goods visible inside the hull. Divers were able to confirm the ship's identity through her serial markings and cargo. The ship's sinking is still not fully understood. There were no signs of collision, explosion, or fire, suggesting she may have taken on water slowly or succumbed to ice buildup during the storm. It is believed that the crew may have tried to seek shelter on the nearby isle, but were overtaken by the weather. Though the wreck has now been found, the story of the Kamloops continues to fascinate maritime historians. The cold, deep water of Lake Superior preserved her in near pristine state, allowing researchers a rare look at a lost Great Lakes freighter. Today, the site is protected under the Isle Royale National Park and monitored to ensure the preservation of it. Moving on to number 7, the SS Bannockburn. The SS Bannockburn, a Canadian freighter built in 1893, vanished on Lake Superior on November 21, 1902, during a routine voyage from Fort Williams, now Thunder Bay, Ontario, to Midland, Ontario, carrying a load of wheat. Known as a workhorse vessel of the Great Lakes, the Bannockburn had made many successful trips and was regarded as reliable. On this voyage, she was crewed by a young team and departed in decent weather. But after rounding the eastern end of Lake Superior, the Bannockburn was never seen again. The last confirmed sighting came from the SS Algonquin, another freighter that passed the Bannockburn later in the day near Caribou Island. Nothing appeared out of the ordinary, but when the ship failed to arrive in Midland, alarm spread quickly. Search efforts were made along the shoreline and out to sea, but no wreckage, cargo, or lifeboats were found. The ship had simply vanished. This lack of physical evidence baffled the investigators. One theory was that the Bannockburn may have struck an unmarked shoal near Caribou Island, a dangerous area, before modern navigation buoys were installed. This could have caused the ship to founder quickly in deep water. Another possibility was hull failure in the cold water. Lake Superior had been known to claim ships under similar conditions. Though presumed sunk, the exact location of the wreck remains unknown. Over the years, divers and sonar expeditions have searched portions of the lake, but no definitive discovery has been made. Its disappearance was one of the earliest major ship losses on the Great Lakes in the 20th century, and it drew considerable attention at the time. What makes this story especially compelling is the ship's reputation as the Flying Dutchman of the Great Lakes. Decades after her disappearance, mariners claimed to spot a phantom freighter in the heavy fog, usually in the same region where the Bannockburn was last seen. Though these stories remain folklore, the real mystery remains. A fully loaded grain carrier in known waters vanished entirely, leaving behind no trace. Number 6. The SS Hewitt. The SS Hewitt was a 5,000-ton American cargo ship that vanished without a trace in January 1921 while en route from Sabine, Texas to Boston, Massachusetts. Built in 1914 and operated by the Union Sulphur Company, the Hewitt was considered modern and in good condition. It had departed Sabine on January 20th carrying general cargo and a crew of 42. The ship made a routine radio check-in on January 24th off the coast of Florida. After that, all communication stopped. When the Hewitt failed to arrive in Boston on schedule, concern grew, and extensive search was initiated by the U.S. Coast Guard. The ship's route took it along one of the most heavily traveled portions of the American coastline, yet no debris, oil slick, or cargo were ever recovered. At the time, there were reports of an explosion seen offshore in the general vicinity of where the Hewitt might have been. A few maritime observers suggested possible collisions or a boiler explosion, but no corroborating evidence was found. Others speculated about weather-related instability, but no major storm activity was recorded along the route. Adding to this mystery, the ship had no history of instability or mechanical issues, and its crew was experienced. In the absence of distress signals or sightings, the vessel simply disappeared into open water. The Navy and shipping authorities investigated for months, but were unable to draw any firm conclusions. The Hewitt and its entire crew were eventually declared lost at sea. What makes this one especially puzzling is that it happened in well-trafficked, well-patrolled waters, unlike other mysterious vanishings in more remote parts. It was a large, well-maintained ship in calm conditions, with up-to-date radio equipment for its time. Its complete and sudden disappearance remains one of the least understood losses in American maritime history. To this day, no part of the SS Hewitt has been found, and her final state remains unknown. Number 5. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald. The SS Edmund Fitzgerald. It was a 729-foot American freighter that vanished on Lake Superior on November 10, 1975, during a routine voyage from Superior, Wisconsin to Detroit, Michigan, carrying over 26,000 tons of taconite pellets. At the time of its launch in 1957, it was the largest ship on the Great Lakes, and it remained one of the most recognized and respected vessels. The Fitzgerald's final voyage began uneventfully, but as it entered open waters, it encountered a powerful storm. With wind gusts exceeding 70 miles an hour and waves reported at over 20 feet high, the ship faced harsh conditions. It was in contact with another vessel, the Arthur M. Anderson, throughout the journey, and the two ships stayed within radar range and exchanged communications regularly, with the Fitzgerald reporting weather damage but continuing to sail. At approximately 7:10 p.m. on November 10th, the Edmund Fitzgerald radioed that it was holding its own. About 10 minutes later, it vanished from radar screens without issuing any distress signal. The Anderson was the last vessel to see or hear from the Fitzgerald. Despite the poor weather, the Coast Guard launched a search operation that night. The next day, aircraft located debris and lifeboats floating in the area, but no survivors or bodies were ever recovered. Within days, sonar scans confirmed the wreck was resting on the lake bed in two large pieces. The ship had sunk in Canadian waters about 17 miles from Whitefish Bay. Investigations followed, led by the U.S. Coast Guard, the National Transportation Safety Board, and other organizations. The exact cause remains unknown. Some theories, though, suggest the ship suffered from structural failure due to stress from massive waves. Others suggest a sudden flood through damaged hatches or a failure in the cargo hold. Despite multiple studies, though, no single explanation has been universally accepted. The wreck was eventually explored by submersibles, and the hull was found to be largely intact, split near the middle. The ship is lying in over 500 feet of water, and it's become the subject of continued study and commemoration. And while the wreck has been found, her sudden disappearance and the absence of a distress call continue to raise questions. The case remains one of the most famous modern ship disappearances on the Great Lakes, and it's a reminder of how quickly conditions on inland waters can change. Number 4. The SS City of Boston. The SS City of Boston was a British passenger steamship located on the Inman Line that disappeared in January of 1870 while en route from Halifax, Nova Scotia to Liverpool, England. Built in 1864, the ship was part of a respected transatlantic fleet, and it was outfitted to carry both mail and passengers. It had completed several voyages across the Atlantic without any issues, but on January 28, 1870, the ship departed Halifax with more than 190 people on board, including passengers and crew, along with a load of mail. She was last seen leaving port under favorable weather conditions. After that, no communications or sightings were ever recorded. When the ship failed to arrive in Liverpool after the expected transit time, concern spread across both sides of the Atlantic. Several ships were dispatched to search for signs of wreckage or survivors, but no debris or messages were ever recovered. The ship had simply vanished somewhere in the vast North Atlantic. Theories were put forward at the time, including the possibility of encountering sea ice, striking an uncharted object, or suffering mechanical failure. Still others believed that storms developed days after the departure might have caught the ship off guard. However, none of these ideas were supported by any hard evidence. Complicating the story was the fact that the ship had undergone modification shortly before departure, including a reported change in the positioning of its propeller shaft. Some speculated that the engineering changes may have compromised efficiency or stability, but there were no official findings to confirm this. The loss of the SS City of Boston was particularly significant in the 19th century, as it involved the disappearance of a prominent ocean liner with no trace. It triggered renewed discussions about ship safety standards, communications, and the need for coordinated reporting. To this day, the ship has never been found. It remains one of the most puzzling unsolved maritime disappearances of the 19th century. Number 3. The SV Resolven. The SV Resolven was a small British merchant bark that became one of the more understated but genuinely puzzling maritime mysteries of the 19th century. Built to serve as a coastal cargo ship, the Resolven was not famous or remarkable by design. She was sturdy, modest in size, and well-suited for her intended routes, which typically included transatlantic trips between ports in North America and the British Isles. But in August of 1884, she became something else entirely, an officially documented ghost ship found drifting silently in the icy northern waters without her crew, her lifeboats, or any clear explanation as to what the hell happened. The events surrounding the disappearance began on August 27, 1884, when she was sighted adrift off the coast of Newfoundland by the British warship HMS Mallard. At the time, she was floating aimlessly in the Labrador Sea, not far from where icebergs were known to pass. When officers from the Mallard boarded the Resolven, they were surprised to find the ship completely abandoned. The sails were set, but flapping loosely in the wind. There was no one at the helm, no response from below deck, and no apparent damage to the hull that would explain a hasty departure. The Discovery team found several unusual things. First, the ship's lifeboat was missing, indicating that the crew had likely left voluntarily. Second, the galley still had recently prepared food, and most of the crew's personal belongings were undisturbed. The cargo, timber, and general goods was completely intact. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no fire, and no water ingress. In fact, the ship was in seaworthy condition. Her hull was sound, her sails were still functional, despite needing attention. It was as though the crew had vanished mid-voyage for no visible reason. One of the most perplexing details was that the ship had been adrift for only a short time. According to maritime reports, the ship had last been seen departing Quebec, Canada, on a voyage bound for Swansea in Wales. The ship had been at sea for just 6 days before being found abandoned. Based on the state of the provisions, the recentness of the cooking activity, and the condition of the ship, authorities concluded that the crew likely abandoned the ship within 24 to 48 hours of its discovery. At the time of its departure from Quebec, the ship was under the command of Captain John James. The rest of the crew consisted of 6 sailors and the captain's wife, who was accompanying him on this voyage. All were considered competent mariners, and nothing in the ship's background suggested any history of crew unrest, unseaworthiness, or any potential warning signs. Upon discovery of the abandoned ship, the officers of the HMS Mallard towed the Resolven to St. John's, Newfoundland, where a formal inquiry was opened. The ship's log had not been updated in several days, but this was not especially unusual for a small merchant ship. What stood out, however, was the absence of any written note, warning, or final message from the captain or officers. Not a single document offered any explanation for why the entire crew abandoned a perfectly functional vessel. Maritime experts began to speculate. One early theory was that the Resolven may have had a close encounter with an iceberg in the fog. In such conditions, an inexperienced or panicked crew might believe the ship had suffered hull damage, even if it had not. In the darkness and confusion, they could have abandoned the ship prematurely. But this theory didn't fully explain the absence of visible damage or flooding, and most believe that the seasoned crew would have known better than to leave a dry, intact ship for the uncertainty of open water. Another possibility was the buildup of toxic gases in the hold. Certain cargo types, especially if improperly stored or reacting to the hull's conditions, could cause the formation of a gas. A sudden odor or bout of dizziness might panic a crew into thinking the ship was in danger of explosion. However, there was no chemical cargo aboard the Resolven. She was carrying timber and general goods. There was also no evidence of a fire or explosion, and no later findings suggested unusual conditions in the hold. The lifeboat theory remained the most plausible. The ship's missing boat suggested a deliberate evacuation, and it is likely that the crew, for reasons unknown, believed the ship was going to sink or become otherwise uninhabitable. Fog, low visibility, and frigid temperatures in the Labrador Sea would have made rescue difficult, especially in 1884, when ship-to-ship communication was limited to flags, signals, or direct shouting. If the crew had launched the lifeboat under mistaken assumptions and rowed into the fog or current, they could have easily been swept into open waters and lost. But even this leaves open a critical question: why did they leave a ship that was dry, stocked with supplies, and structurally sound? The captain's wife being on board added some emotional weight to this mystery. It was uncommon, but not unheard of, for a captain's wife to accompany her husband on a voyage. Her presence likely influenced the decision-making dynamic aboard the ship. Would the crew have forced an evacuation against the captain's will? Would the captain have voluntarily led such a departure despite the ship being seaworthy? These are the kinds of questions the inquiry failed to answer. Over time, the story of the Resolven has faded into the background of maritime history, overshadowed by more sensational tales like the Mary Celeste. However, the Resolven has one key difference. It was found very soon after abandonment in an area that was relatively well-traveled for its time and in nearly perfect condition. This makes this case particularly difficult to dismiss as folklore or exaggeration. Today, the ship is often mentioned in lists of documented and abandoned vessels, particularly those in the North Atlantic, and it's an early example of how rapidly things can go wrong at sea, even in the absence of a major storm, a pirate attack, or a mechanical failure. No wreckage of the lifeboat was ever found. No remains of the crew were ever recovered. No message in a bottle, log page, or letter has ever surfaced to shed some light on what happened in those final hours. That makes it one of the most quietly disturbing and persistently baffling ship abandonment cases on record, not because of what we found, but because of what we didn't. Number 2. The Carroll A. Deering. The Carroll A. Deering was a 5-masted schooner launched in 1919 from the G.G. Deering shipyard in Bath, Maine. Built during the twilight years of large commercial sailing vessels, it was designed to haul bulk cargo like coal and grain. At 255 feet long and weighing about 1,800 gross tons, it was one of the last and largest of its kind. Its launch marked a final effort to keep large schooners commercially competitive, and for a time, the Deering performed exactly as expected. But in early 1921, it became the center of one of the greatest mysteries in American history. In August 1920, the Deering set out from Norfolk, Virginia, bound for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, with a full load of coal. It was originally under the command of Captain William H. Merritt, an experienced mariner. However, shortly after departing, Captain Merritt fell ill, and the ship was forced to return to port. Merritt was replaced by Captain Willis B. Wormel, a retired 66-year-old shipmaster from Maine who was coaxed back to sea for this voyage. First mate duties were handed over to Charles B. McClellan, and the change in leadership seemed straightforward at the time, but it later became a focal point in understanding what may have gone wrong. The Deering made the voyage to Brazil without any recorded issues. Captain Wormel was respected, but reports later emerged that he was not well liked by his crew and that tensions may have been growing on board during the voyage. After unloading coal in Rio de Janeiro, the ship prepared for its return journey to the U.S., sailing first to Barbados for supplies. It was there that Captain Wormel reportedly had several candid conversations with his fellow mariners. According to the captain of another schooner, Wormel expressed conditions about his crew, especially the first mate, whom he accused of open insubordination. Another witness claimed Wormel said he didn't trust most of the men aboard his ship and feared they might cause trouble. These comments, though not officially documented in any log, were later given serious consideration during investigations. The Deering departed Barbados on January 9, 1921, heading for Newport News, Virginia. This stretch of the Atlantic is heavily trafficked and it's well mapped, but it includes some dangerous areas like the Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. This area is known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. This region is infamous for shipwrecks. On January 28, 1921, the Cape Lookout lightship reported seeing the Deering. A man on board hailed the lightship, saying the schooner had lost its anchors and asked the ship's owners be notified. This was odd, not only because the request was relayed by someone other than the captain, but also because the man reportedly had an unusual accent and didn't appear to be a senior officer. Due to heavy weather and the poor visibility, the lightship crew couldn't ask follow-up questions. They did, however, make note of the exchange. On January 31st, just 3 days after that sighting, the Deering was found aground on the Diamond Shoals by a Coast Guard station. The ship was perched high on a sandbar, sails tattered, and its deck empty. A Coast Guard rescue party attempted to board the vessel but was initially delayed by rough seas. When they were finally able to climb on board on February 4th, what they found was baffling. The ship's lifeboats were missing, as were all 10 crew members. The wheel was shattered, the binnacle box had been smashed, and the ship's navigation equipment and logbooks were gone. The ship appeared to have been abandoned in a hurry, but not in a state of severe emergency. The Coast Guard launched an investigation almost immediately. The possibility of piracy was considered, though no signs of a struggle or looting were evident. A mutiny theory also gained traction due to Captain Warmel's comments in Barbados, but there was no hard evidence to prove it. The presence of the unidentified crewman who hailed the lightship was treated as suspicious, but that line of inquiry produced no leads. No bodies were ever recovered, nor were any of the Deering's lifeboats found. No messages in bottles, flares, or other evidence washed ashore. The crew had simply vanished. One odd element in the case was the relative silence of the shipping company that owned the Deering. They offered little public comment beyond cooperating with the investigation. Some speculated this was due to liability concerns or to avoid further scrutiny of any labor issues, which were a hot-button topic in the maritime circles at the time. Around the same period, a wave of labor unrest and shipping disputes was affecting the industry, and there was concern that mutinies might be occurring more frequently than publicly acknowledged. The final U.S. government report issued later in 1921 concluded that the ship had been abandoned for reasons unknown. No conclusive cause was offered, and while investigators leaned towards a theory involving a mutiny or misunderstanding, leading the crew to abandoning ship and being lost at sea, this could not be proven. The case was closed without a clear resolution. Over 100 years later, the Carroll A. Deering remains a subject of curiosity for historians, sailors, and mystery enthusiasts. It's a symbol of how the sea, despite centuries of navigation and mapping, can still erase all traces of a crew in a single moment, without explanation, without warning, and without leaving behind any witnesses. Number 1. The SV Mary Celeste. The SV Mary Celeste is arguably the most famous ghost ship in maritime history, not because she disappeared, but because she didn't. Instead, she was found adrift in the Atlantic Ocean on December 4, 1872, completely intact and under full sail, but with no one on board. The American merchant brigantine had left New York City on November 7, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy, with a cargo of industrial alcohol. She was crewed by Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife, their young daughter, and 7 experienced sailors. The ship was well provisioned and seaworthy when she departed. About a month later, the British ship De Gratia spotted the Mary Celeste near the Azores. Her sails were partially set, but something seemed off. Upon boarding, the crew of the De Gratia discovered that the ship was completely abandoned. The lifeboat was missing, the logbook ended abruptly, and the personal belongings of the crew were still in place. The cargo was largely intact and there were no signs of violence or piracy. Food stores were untouched and there was no indication that the ship had encountered any event. What made the mystery more intense was that the Mary Celeste had been sailing normally. There was no sign of flooding or damage to the hull that would warrant abandoning the ship. While a pump was found disassembled and there were a few feet of water in the hold, the ship was otherwise perfectly capable of continuing its journey. No message was left behind and no distress signal had been sent. The De Gratia crew sailed the abandoned ship to Gibraltar, where maritime authorities began an investigation. Theories emerged almost immediately, ranging from a sudden sea quake or waterspout to alcohol fumes from the cargo leaking and causing the crew to believe an explosion was imminent. Still, none of these explanations have been proven. The salvage hearing cleared the De Gratia of wrongdoing, but couldn't determine why the Mary Celeste had been abandoned. Investigators ruled out foul play, but they couldn't explain why a competent captain and experienced crew would leave a seaworthy ship in calm weather. The ship itself had a long history before and after the incident. Originally, it was launched as the Amazon in 1861. She underwent several name changes and ownership transfers, but after the 1872 incident, she continued to operate under various owners until she was intentionally wrecked off Haiti in 1885 in an unsuccessful insurance fraud scheme. Despite the extensive records, the official investigations, and modern analysis, the mystery of why the Mary Celeste was abandoned endures. Unlike fictional tales, the ship's recovery is fully documented, the timeline of events is verifiable, and the absence of the crew remains unexplained. The Mary Celeste case continues to be studied. It's referenced in maritime law and retold in naval training as a case study in unexplained disappearances. She wasn't lost to the sea, but the people aboard her were, and no one has ever been able to say for sure why.